Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Fitness Pollenator podcast. In this episode, I will be discussing the acute effects of pre-activity stretching on muscle performance. When a fraction of a second can mean the difference between Olympic gold and silver, we want to be able to tease out the effects of every aspect of our preparation. Of particular interest to me is warm-up, and whether or not stretching should be a part of it. Traditionally, warm-up has three components. First is a low-intensity aerobic activity like jogging. Second is static stretching. And third is a sport-specific drill. The question is, what does the science have to say about the effect of stretching on performance? To get at the answer to this question, I performed a literature search of the Pedro and PubMed databases, and I subsequently cross-referenced the articles that I found there to find the 12 papers that I ultimately used. So 9 of them were reviews, 1 was a meta-analysis, 1 an invited commentary, and 1 a position statement. The search terms I used were static stretching, which is defined as moving a limb to its end range of motion and holding it for a set period of time. Dynamic stretching, defined as the controlled movement through the active range of motion of a joint. And acute, or the pre-activity period, that's to be contrasted with chronic or regular stretching. And then my performance measures were strength and power. Stretching has a lot of purported benefits, some of which have been shown to be true and some perhaps not true. So it does increase range of motion. It may or may not reduce injuries. It probably doesn't reduce muscle soreness. And the question that I'm particularly interested in is, does it enhance performance? Hundreds of studies have looked at the acute effects of static stretching. And the performance measures that they have investigated are things like 1 rep max, isometric torque production, jumping, sprinting, throwing, etc. The trouble is that there are lots of contradictory results. Many, but not all studies report static stretch-induced performance impairments. But some don't. So why the contradictory results? Well, it could be due to poor study design. In a meta-analysis of over 100 studies, the average score on a quality test was 4 out of 10. The reason for the low score? Oftentimes, the studies lack randomization, a control group, blinding. Obviously, you can't blind somebody as to whether or not they have stretched. Reliability analysis, and finally, it's difficult to standardize stretch intensity. So, in order to draw any conclusions, we have to consider the entire body of evidence. Fortunately, Simic et al. Did that for us in 2013 with a meta-analysis of 104 studies. They grouped the studies into 3 different categories. The first was maximal muscle strength. They set a threshold for a practically relevant change of negative 5% and found a likely negative effect of static stretching. For muscle power, their threshold was negative 1%, and they found an unclear effect. And finally, for explosive muscle performance, their threshold was again negative 1%, and they found a very likely negative effect. Also in this study, they found that the performance impairments were independent of age, sex, and training status, making them very broadly applicable. In another review paper from 2012, the authors found similar performance impairments, and they found them to be independent of contraction type, be it concentric or isometric, independent of muscle group, be it biarticular, uniarticular, and even independent of movement speed. So what's causing these performance impairments? Well, it's a combination of neural and muscular influences. We have decreased motor unit activation and decreased EMG activity, as well as reduced musculotendinous stiffness. which basically means that the muscle fibers are sliding with less resistance. These effects can last anywhere from 15 minutes to up to 1 to 2 hours. We also see a definite dose-response relationship, meaning that as the duration of the stretch increases, the magnitude and duration of the performance impairments also increase. So the question becomes, is there a threshold below which there will be no impairment? One review paper showed that stretches shorter than 45 seconds may not cause performance impairments. However, a more statistically rigorous meta-analysis in 2013 showed that these same stretch durations may cause performance impairments. Another problem is that we can't necessarily generalize these studies to real-world athletic endeavors. In order to figure out what the effects of static stretching are, the static stretching is often isolated as opposed to being used as part of a comprehensive warm-up with low-intensity aerobic at the beginning and sport-specific drills at the end. Furthermore, average stretch durations for most athletes are generally under 20 seconds. So studies looking at stretches lasting upwards of 90 seconds have very little relevance. And then there's the question of what the heck does isokinetic torque production mean in terms of sports performance? So lab measures are really just a proxy for sports performance, which is very complex. Now for the acute effects of dynamic stretching. We have small gains in range of motion, similar to those we see with static stretching. We have performance enhancement, or at least no performance impairment. And then we have a possible reversal of static stretch-induced impairments when dynamic stretching is used following static stretching. The mechanisms for this performance enhancement are post-activation potentiation, increased body and muscle temperature, as well as enhanced neuromuscular control and activation. So, are these effects significant from a practical standpoint? Well, effect sizes are typically low to moderate, meaning that the effect on performance may actually be limited in practice. But when we're talking about tenths or hundredths of a second, those differences can matter. So it really depends on the sport and the level of competition. All this leads to my final recommendation, which is two parts. Part one is, when all performance impairments are to be avoided, no matter how small, static stretching should be reserved for post-activity or a separate session altogether, with dynamic stretching used instead for its potential performance-enhancing effects. However, there are a few mitigating factors, such as psychology. Static stretching can make you very relaxed, and that could actually improve your performance. Also, there's this idea of the reverse placebo effect, where if you have a history of using static stretching and believing in its benefits, then suddenly eliminating it could have a negative effect on your performance. Also, there are numerous activities that require high degrees of flexibility, like diving and hockey, especially for goalies, and wrestling. If you can't get into the positions that you need for your sport without static stretching, then eliminating static stretching is obviously going to have a negative effect. So that leads me to part two of my recommendation, which is that if pre-activity static stretching is deemed necessary, then it should be performed with a few stipulations. One, it should be performed well prior to activity, at least 15 minutes, for a short duration, less than 45 seconds per muscle group, in a range without discomfort. And finally, it should be followed up with dynamic stretching in order to reduce impairments. Here is a list of my references. Thank you so much for watching.